The summer air over Fort McHenry was thick with smoke and salt from the Chesapeake Bay. The year was 1814, and the United States, still a young nation, was at war again with Britain. For weeks, Baltimore had been bracing for attack. The people whispered about the British fleet sailing up the coast, their ships darkening the horizon like a storm. Inside the walls of the fort, a man named Sergeant William Carney tightened his grip on the wooden pole of the great American flag and looked out toward the bay. He was not a general or politician. He was a soldier, tired, sunburned, and proud. The flag that flew over Fort McHenry was huge, 30 feet high and 42 feet long, sewn by hand by a Baltimore seamstress named Mary Bakerskill. To the man at the fort, it wasn't just a banner. It was a promisee that the land they stood upon belonged to a people who refused to kneel. As dusk fell, the first British rockets screamed through the sky. They arced over the water like burning comets and crashed into the walls with thunderous bursts of flame. Men scrambled to their stations, shouting orders through the roar of cannon fire. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Carney's ears rang, but his mind was steady. He had fought before. He knew fear, and he knew duty. He looked once at the flag, its stripes rippling in the wind above the ramparts, and he swore silently that no enemy shell would bring it down. The bombardment lasted all night. Hour after hour, the British guns hammered the fort. The sky turned red, then black, then red again with each explosion. The men huddled in the dirt, loading and firing. Loading and firing. Every time the cannons fell silent, they waited, listening for the next barrage. Sometime after midnight, a shell exploded near the flagpole. The blast tore through the rampart, shattering stone and earth. When the smoke cleared, the flag hung limp up. Its rope snapped, its lower edge torn. For a moment, the men stared in horror, thinking it had fallen. Carney leapt forward before anyone else could move. Ignoring the shouting and the flying debris, he climbed the embankment and seized the pole. Splinters tore into his hands, but he held fast. With every ounce of strength, he lifted the flag back upright and lashed the broken ropes with a strip of his own uniform. "Hold it steady, Sergeant!" someone shouted. "I will," Carney called back, "as long as I live. It stays up." Through the night, he stood by that pole, his body battered by wind and shrapnel. Each time a shell burst nearby, the light illuminated his fascia. Grim, determined, and unyielding. Men around him were falling, wounded or dead, but the flag did not move. Far across the water, aboard one of the British ships, a young lawyer named Francis Scott Key watched the bombardment. He had come to negotiate the release of a prisoner but was detained by the British until the attack ended. All night he stood on deck, peering through the smoke, straining to see if the American flag still flew over the fort. "Do you think they'll surrender?" one British officer asked him. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He only stared at the flashes in the distance, praying silently that the stars and stripes would still be there come dawn. Back inside the fort, the bombardment reached its peak. The ground shook. A cannon exploded near the rampart, throwing Carney to the ground. His left arm burned with pain, but when he saw the flag sag again, he dragged himself upright. The pole was split, the cloth torn in half. Without thinking, Carney caught the falling fabric and tied it to the stump of the broken pole. He used the strap of his musket and a piece of rope from a fallen cannon carriage to secure it. Then, leaning his weight against the pole, he braced it upright once more. Blood trickled down his arm, but he didn't care. The flag was still flying. When dawn finally came, the bombardment stopped. A strange silence fell over the bay. The smoke began to lift, and the first light of morning crept across the water. The men in the fort looked up exhausted, half-deaf, their faces blackened with soot, and there it was, the American flag, tattered but still standing. A cheer rose from the ramparts, hoarse and ragged but full of life. Carney sank to his knees, clutching the flagpole, tears mixing with dirt on his face. The men around him clapped his shoulders and raised their fists toward the sky. They had survived. The flag had survived. Out on the water, Francis Scott Key saw it too. Against the pale dawn, the stars and stripes waved defiantly, larger than life. The sight filled him with awe, and before he even realized what he was doing, he began to scribble words on the back of a letter, words that would one day become a nation's anthem. "Oh, sa can you see, by the dawn's early light a broken bar." That day, the British fleet turned away. They could not break the fort, and they could not break the spirit that burned within it. The defenders of Fort McHenry had held, and with them, the hope of an entire nation. For William Carney, the memory of that night never faded. He carried the scars for the rest of his life, but he never spoke of them as wounds. He called them reminders of proof that freedom had a price worth paying. Years later, as an old man, Carney sat on the porch of his modest home in Massachusetts, the flag he had once saved folded neatly on his lap. Children from the neighborhood would come to listen to his stories, wide-eyed and quiet. "Tell us again, Mr. Carney," one boy would beg. "Tell us about the night the flag almost fell." And Carney would smile, his eyes distant, seeing again the smoke and fire over the bay. "It didn't almost fall," he would say softly. "It was never going to fall, not while any of us were still standing." He would run his hand gently over the worn fabric, its edges still frayed from that night long ago. "You see, that flag is more than cloth and thread," he would continue. "It's a heartbeat. When it waves, it reminds us who we are and what we stand for. I only held it up. Habit. The courage that kept it flying came from every man who stood with me." When he died, they buried him with full military honors, the flag draped across his coffin. At the ceremony, a band played softly, and veterans stood at attention. Among them was a younger soldier who had once heard Carney's story as a child. He removed his hat, eyes glistening, and whispered, "Rest easy, Sergeant." The flag still flies. Decades later, when people spoke of heroes, they often mentioned generals and presidents. But among those who knew history well, there was a quiet reverence for the man who had saved the flag, of the man who, in the darkest hour, had stood tall against the storm. His story became part of the nation's memory, told and retold wherever patriotism lived. In classrooms, teachers spoke of him. In parades, his name was carried on banners. And in every home where the flag was raised, it flew not just for victory, but for resiliency, for the strength of those who refused to let it fall. Generations passed, wars came and went, but the spirit of that night endured. The flags that had flown over Fort McHenry still exists, preserved in the Smithsonian, faded but proud. People stand before it in silence, awed by the sheer size of it, the history stitched into every thread. And if you listen closely, standing there, you might almost hear the echo of cannon fire, the crackle of flame, the wind whipping across the ramparts. You might see, in your mind's eye, a lone figure gripping the pole, refusing to yield. Because in that moment, the flag was not just a symbol, it was the soul of a nation. And one man, standing amid fire and fear, had kept that soul alive. Every time the anthem plays, every time those first notes rise and the words fill the air, his story lives again. Not in fame or glory, but in the quiet courage that defines America itself. So when the crowd sings, and the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave, they are, in truth, singing for him, for William Carney, the man who saved the American flag. And somewhere beyond time, perhaps his spirit still stands on that rampart, the dawn breaking over the Chesapeake, the flag in his hands, the wind in his hair, and the light of freedom rising with the sun.